So, okay, we'll go ahead and have the message now. I was not going to speak today. We gave a Bible study this past week, and I spent quite a bit of time on that study, and then I'm speaking tomorrow, so I was going to use a pre-recorded message today. But after studying the subject and looking at some of the aspects of Pentecost, I found that, well, I can really just split the message up into two sermons. We'll give the first part today, the second part I'll give tomorrow. As we know, today is 49, day 49 in the count to Pentecost, and so tomorrow is the 50th day in the count to the Feast of Weeks. And this count of 7 sets of 7 weeks is unique in the Scriptures, but there is a pattern that is the same, that marks 7 sets of 7 and then marking the 50th day. And that's found in the count to the year of Jubilee. Now, Pentecost, it's 7 times 7 weeks plus 1 is 50, and Jubilee is 7 times 7 years plus 1, and the count ends at 50. The 50th year is observed. And so the patterns in this are identical, and God is always multifaceted in what he does, the things that he has designed, as particularly the holy days. And so because of this pattern, when it comes to numbering, we see that there must be a similarity between Pentecost and the Jubilee in some or perhaps multiple ways in the meaning of these two observances and how they are connected to one another. And so that's what I would like to talk about today in part. And I'm going to finish it tomorrow, part 2 of this message. But in order to cover the subject adequately, we first need to discuss an observance that's connected to the Jubilee, an observance that was called a Sabbath solemn rest for the land. Sabbath solemn rest for the land. So let's go ahead and open to Exodus 23. Exodus chapter 23, first place where this is mentioned. And some of us, or most of us, are at least somewhat familiar with the subject. And I'd given a Bible study on it some time ago, but I think it's a good reminder and very helpful when better understanding tomorrow's observance of Pentecost. Some people would call this year-long Sabbath rest for the land a sabbatical year, and I think that is an appropriate term. God actually does refer to it as a Sabbath, actually. And even though there is not a cancellation of work throughout all of the year, it is considered a Sabbath rest for the land. So it has to do with sowing the land, planting. It has to do with reaping, and it has to do with allowing the land to remain fallow so that it can benefit. Not only the land could benefit, but people and animals even could benefit, as we'll see. So the instructions for this year of rest for the land was given during the first year or two after Israel had left Egypt. And they gathered at Mount Sinai. They were given various instructions by God, a variety of instructions, including the instructions to build the tabernacle. They made a covenant with God at that time. And then they were also given lessons, laws, about how they would live after they went across the border into Canaan, into the promised land, because the nation was to function under God, both practically and ethically. And we see that God is both ethical and he is practical. His laws are not unreasonable. They are entirely reasonable, and they are of great benefit. And we saw this past week when we went through the Bible study discussing manna. Exodus 23 has some of these rules of behavior, and verses 10 and 11 says, 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its produce. But the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. So this applied to any type of farming, basically. It didn't matter what type of food you were planting, even if it were apple trees. It was the same thing if you had an orchard. And so he goes on to say, it's interesting, the very next verse says, 6 days you shall work, and on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female servant and the stranger may be refreshed. In all that I have said, you must be circumspect, and obey these rules, in other words. So it seems that mentioning the rest for the land, and then right afterward, God mentions the weekly Sabbath rest. It's reiterated here. It was actually mentioned several times previously. We see that there must be some kind of reason for the sequence. It wasn't by accident that God said, here's the 7-year rest for the land, and keep the seventh day, rest on the seventh day to keep it holy. And so the same numbering system was found in the Sabbath rest for the land as well as for the weekly Sabbath, where people are required to rest from their labor the seventh day, so the land is required by God, designated to rest every seventh year. And so with this in mind, I think we begin to recognize how this Sabbath rest for the land was of enormous benefit. Again, not just for the land, but for people and even animals, God indicates. Let's go to Leviticus 25, where this is discussed a bit deeper. Leviticus 25. It's written that the poor and the animals could eat whatever they wanted from what grew of itself during the seventh year, and this meant, therefore, that landowners, people were not to actually sow, they were not to plant fresh new seed for the coming year of rest, but they would just let things kind of go on their own. And it also meant that landowners should not install barriers or fences in an attempt to keep people and animals out of their property at that time. Now, I would think, again, you have to think practically about this, that some fencing may have been installed, walls, whatever, fencing would have been installed around certain areas to keep animals out throughout the other years, the other 6 years. And I would not think that God would expect everybody to tear down the walls. There's no instruction there to tear down all your fencing during the seventh year. But again, practically speaking, it seems like there would have to be some kind of entrance, some way allowed for people to come in to get food, not just the landowners, but others who, the poor, as it says, strangers. And then in what was left, the animals were allowed to eat those things that were left. So again, there's no instructions for this. This is just my thinking only. It's just my opinion. But since the seventh year rest for the land would serve the needs of those who might otherwise struggle to have adequate portions of food other years, and animals were allowed to eat what they desired, it's, I think, logical to conclude that there would need to be ways to access this land available. No barbed wire, locking everything out. So only the people that own the land can get in and get some of the produce that grew of itself. Now, gleaning is something that we know. This is something that was to be allowed every year. Every year, the people that owned land, had property, were not to reap everything so that people that were needy or poor or strangers in the land would not starve. And we see that in Leviticus 19. It actually specifically says that during those 6 years of reaping, that landowners were not to take everything, that they were to leave corners of the field, it says. Don't take all the fruit in the corners of the field, because those would be places likely most easily accessible to those people in need or the poor. And it says not to even take every grape off of a vine, to leave some for those people in need. Now, when it comes to those things that grew of itself during the seventh year, Leviticus 25 adds more detail in this regard of how the year was to be kept. In the first verse, we're going to read the first 7 verses here, Leviticus 25. The Eternal spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give you, then the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Eternal. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Eternal. And you shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. What grows of its own accord of your harvest you shall not reap, nor gather the grapes of your untended vine, for it is a year of rest for the land. And the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you, for your male and your female servants, your hired man and the stranger who dwells with you, for your livestock, and the beasts that are in your land, wild animals. All its produce shall be for food. So it means it shall be for food for people to eat individually, personally. It's not to be reaped for commercial purposes. And so this chapter calls the seventh year a Sabbath of rest for the land. It's the same, actually, description. If you think of the phrasing, it's the same description that's given to the seventh day Sabbath. And so I think this, again, helps us, will further see that this helps us to understand its connection to Pentecost, where 7 weeks are to be numbered. Now, consider some of the phrasing here, how it's similar to the Sabbath commandment. God said in verse 3 that we had just read, 6 years you shall sow your field, 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. Well, the fourth commandment, found in Exodus 20 and verse 9, says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. These are things that must be done. It's not an option not to work. You have to work. And so in verse 4 of this chapter that we just read, but the seventh year shall be a Sabbath of rest for the land, a Sabbath to the eternal. You shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Well, this fourth commandment, Exodus 20 and verse 10 says, but the seventh is the Sabbath of the eternal your God. And continuing in verse 4, you shall neither sow your field or prune your vineyard. And again, Exodus 20 and verse 10 says, in it you shall do no work, nor your son, your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, your ox, or your donkey, or the stranger that is within your gates. And so this similar phrasing between the Sabbath commandment, the fourth commandment, and the command for a Sabbath year of rest, it's uncanny, is really. These are the only two commands of God that have such similar phrasing. So the seventh year, of course, it should be obvious to us, but the seventh year does not mean that people were not to do any sort of work that year. The context, the instructions here, of course, fall underneath the umbrella of the Ten Commandments, and so 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Seventh is the Sabbath of the eternal your God. Do no work on those days, and that still applied during the seventh year. People were still to work 6 days out of the week and then keep the Sabbath holy. The first 10 always apply. In every situation, they always apply where work was not to be done on the seventh day. Of course, unless there was an emergency, we are very familiar with Christ's example of an ox in a ditch, that if it was necessary to preserve life or property, you could do some work on the Sabbath only for that reason. So the context of is working the land. It's working the land agriculturally. It doesn't mean you couldn't build a barn or you could not build a home on the land. It doesn't mean you couldn't build a canal, if you wanted to, get ready to feed water into your property the next year. It doesn't mean you couldn't do something like that. It talks about the farming, the agriculture that was done regularly. The only work that was allowed on the land, of course, as it says, was work that would be necessary to go out and harvest or gather food individually, food to support yourself or your family, your friends, your neighbor, or the stranger within your gates. And that which grew of itself, that was what would be used without sowing the field. So people were not to anticipate the year of rest for the land and to go out and say, well, I'm going to sow a whole bunch of seed knowing that I can't come back and prune it or what have you, and I'm just going to use that. That was not something that they were to do. They were only to use whatever grew of its own, and that would be produce that would be used throughout the year. Now, as we read in verse 7, verse 6, the Sabbath produce of the land shall be food for you, for your male servant, your female servant, your hired person, and so on. And then for your livestock as well, as it says in verse 7, the beasts of the field also, all its produce should be for food for all of these animals and people most importantly, and then the animals next. So people, again, we have to make a difference between reaping and harvesting, and I'm kind of using those two terms in the context of reaping being that which is done commercially for people to sell or to barter with. That was not to be done with the food. It's just harvesting some food for yourself and your family to eat. As it says in verse 5, what grows of its own accord of your harvest, you shall not reap it. Yeah, of your harvest, you shouldn't reap it, but you shall eat it just for food. So, interestingly, when we moved to Montana more than 13 years ago, my family had joined a community garden on this property. It's just west of here, and most of us have seen it. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of work. I soon after became a volunteer for this community garden to help out with various functions. And I still volunteer to this day. And I guess I wouldn't, the committee where we meet once a month to talk about the functions and what needs done, one gentleman, I think, put it in a good way. He said, it's not so much a community garden as it is a community of gardeners. And I think that's a better term, where people are all gardeners, or, some newer than others. And they have a plot. You pay a small fee, and you have a plot of land, and you can grow pretty much whatever you want on it. They like to be considered an organic community of gardeners, and so there's no pesticides or chemical fertilizers allowed. There's some rules that need to be followed. An interesting and I think a very helpful aspect of this garden here is the mission garden, where people, if you have a plot, you need to commit to giving us a portion of time each week or every couple of weeks to help maintain the mission garden, and that's a lot of food that's grown and given to the needy in the community. And every year they give thousands of pounds. I think, what was this last year? I don't remember. It was like 4,200 pounds of produce was given for people in need in the community. In any case, when we joined this community of gardeners, we first had an 8x8 plot, and then we had, I think, maybe an 8x16, and now we have a 16x16. That's the maximum per family or individual, 16x16 plot. And it's the first time when we joined that my wife and I were able to have a little piece of land where we could grow some produce. And so it's been quite a learning process, and it's an honor, actually, really, I think, to be able to work with God's creation and to see things grow, to help it grow, to learn those little tricks and things that can be done to the earth and to the plants to improve the quality or maintain the quality. But when we joined and we had this little plot of land, I had decided right away that I was going to do this year of rest for the land. Now what I realized, and we did this, I think it was maybe 3 years ago is when we did it the first time, I believe. In any case, what I realized after letting our 16x16 plot fallow for the year is about a month or so into summer is getting out of control. I mean, if you just let things grow, and I'm not talking about things that were vegetables or produce. I'm talking about weeds. It was really getting out of control, in part because nothing was being done to it, but also because unlike some parts of the country or some areas of land, this would get regular watering, 2-3 times a week, depending on the weather. And so things were just really getting out of control. And so what I realized about this is something had to be done. I couldn't just let it go, because if you let something like that go, not only is it going to just continue to spread, but it is going to be so much more difficult the next year to try to get that piece of land under control, to try to get all those weeds. It's going to create all kinds of seeds and everything that is going to fall down to the ground. It's all going to come back in greater number next year. So my opinion of this is that unless God miraculously altered some of the natural processes of the land during a Sabbath year of rest for the land, there had to be some kind of an allowance for people to be able to remove undesired plants, weeds, for example, from the property. Otherwise, it would just be so difficult to try to get it back in control the next year. And so in my case, I waited until it probably got about, some of these were waist high before I got in. I said, I have to do something. Plus, having neighbors in the community of gardeners here, it's like, okay, all those weeds are going to start affecting other people's plots if you don't do something about it. But in any case, it's hard to say exactly what God allowed or intended because there are no instructions here regarding weeding. There's nothing mentioned about that. But the Bible does say to not sow or reap. In other words, reaping for commercial purposes. And the term fallow is used, meaning that you should let things go for the most part. But the context seems to indicate that sowing, pruning of branches or vines, or reaping those plants that were desired, that is really God's focus in this situation. Nothing is said of undesirable plants, that you had to not touch anything, let everything go, but it's also said that you're allowed to remove those. So I think there has to be a judgment call made. But regardless, this year of rest for the land, it would be a great blessing to everyone, both to landowners and to people that did not have land and to animals. Everybody would have or should have what they needed to eat plenty throughout the year. It doesn't mean that, whether you're rich or poor, you are allowed to go out there and stockpile. I'm going to gather food for the next month, or, something I can use to barter with later. That's not the case. That would fall into the category of reaping. But people would have plenty. And even though gleaning was allowed every other year, it may not have provided plenty for those people in need. Oh, they would survive. They wouldn't starve to death. They would have food to eat. And I think that's on purpose, because some people would say, well, hey, I'm just going to glean every year. Why work the land? I'll just go out. I'll have plenty to eat if I just go out and glean. I think God would say, okay, well, you know what? You'll have enough to survive. It's not going to be all that comfortable unless you're really in need. Somebody that was perhaps disabled or elderly or what have you. But there needed to be some incentive for people to work, to get out and, be productive, to help themselves and to help others to be a productive part of society. And so gleaning would provide for the poor, would provide for the needy, so they wouldn't starve. But during these years, the year of Sabbath rest for the land, people would have more than just perhaps meager portions that they might have other years. It would be a great blessing to them. But as we look a little deeper into this subject of the Sabbath year of rest for the land, we see that there was much more to it than that God intended, again, multifaceted in what God does in everything. And so I think what was likely the greatest benefit of this Sabbath year of rest for the land was to preserve the quality of the food that would be eaten, the quality of the crops, the produce. So think about this. Our planet is the only planet that we know of in the entire universe that is covered with this skin. Some people call, I think it's a good analogy, a skin of living dirt. Yes, the dirt that you and I consider to be, most people consider to be cheap, is likely the most valuable resource that we have. And it's alive in many, many ways. Now, not all soil around the earth is the same quality or is the same consistency, but in general, dirt contains all the essentials that are necessary for animal, plant, and human life. Most think that diamonds and rubies and gold and silver and emeralds and copper and all of these precious metals or minerals or rocks, that these things are the most valuable resource in the world. And they are very valuable and they serve many purposes, but dirt is really the most important thing that we have in our lives. Without it, we would simply not be able to exist. And though it is inexpensive because we have it in such large quantities, it is very inexpensive. I heard somebody say that a handful of terrestrial dirt, that means dirt on this planet, has more organized information than the soil on all other known planets combined. That's fascinating. And that's not by accident. This is by design. Astronauts had gathered samples of lunar soil, and they found that when they analyzed it, it was just composed of rock, of monomineralic elements, which basically is defined as glass, things that were totally unusable for agriculture. When we sent the Mars rover to Mars, great hopes of what they would find there, but they pretty much told us something we already had guessed, is that the soil on that planet is useless for life of any form. But the soil found on this planet, the soil that we have available at our fingertips, literally, this soil is special. It contains billions of microorganisms that work together harmoniously, and it creates this environment that's ideal for plant life, for animal life, and for human life. Now, some soil, again, is not the same as others. In a lot of parts of this part of Montana, anyway, the soil is quite clay-like, if you will, kind of hard, and it may take more effort to get the soil ready, to make it ideal for growing certain foods, agricultural use, in other words. But regardless, it's usable. It is all usable under the right conditions, with the right care, I should say. It is usable for food, and we depend on it. We depend on soil to produce our food. We depend on it to purify our environment, to help cleanse the various ecosystems of the earth. And these ecosystems that we live in, that different people live in different ecosystems around the world, they are designed by God to be a great benefit to us, and even to heal us if we become ill. But we see that soil has its limits. Soil just can't do everything on its own all the time. It has its limits, because after years of tilling, after years of sowing, of years of taking, produce out of the land, it begins to lose its quality. It begins to lose its ability to do things properly. I had actually attended a class a couple weeks back about soil, where they had an expert come in, talk about soil and how to best maintain soil, because there are a variety of methods to try to maintain the quality and to replenish the quality of the produce that we might grow in a garden. And so, in order to improve and to preserve the quality of produce, we have to preserve and improve, at times, the quality of dirt, of the soil that we plant seeds in. And the philosophy that was given at this class, and I think it's a good class, is a good one, is that when you take something out, meaning when you reap or harvest your food, you should always consider putting something back into the soil to help replenish the things that you are taking back or taking out. Because continual farming without efforts to replenish, it depletes the minerals, it depletes the microbes that are found in the dirt, and of course it would lead to decreasing the quality of the food that is eaten. So the soil actually was designed by God. Interestingly, it was designed to heal itself if we would simply leave it alone once in a while. As plants grow, they take things from the soil. They take minerals, they take nutrients, they take out the things that they need to produce branches, vines, leaves, and of course, the fruit of the plant. And when plants and trees grow to produce all of those things, whether it be grass or leaves or fruit, those parts of the plant that are grown actually contain many more nutrients and minerals than they take out of the soil. They gather it from the soil, and they also get it from the water that comes down. But plants get much of what they need through a process called photosynthesis. And I'm not going to go into the details of photosynthesis, but basically, it's a miracle. Photosynthesis is a miracle of nature. And we might be able to explain how it works today, that mankind, scientists have been able to analyze photosynthesis and see how plants develop and how they become nutritious and grow. But it is still a miracle that's by design. Mankind cannot do anything like that. Oh, we can create a lot of wonderful and interesting things when it comes to things that are physical, computers, things that are not alive. But when it comes to the creation, we can't recreate that. And the reason is because we're not God. It's a miracle when we look at these things. In any case, during the 7th year, excess produce and also leaves and twigs and plant stems and those things that might come off of those plants that are in the land, those things fall to the ground where they decay, they decompose, and they add these nutrients, as I said, because when a plant grows leaves or produce, it has many more nutrients that are found in the soil. And when those fall off and they're allowed to decompose, they add those nutrients back into the soil. And this greatly helps to restore those things that are lost during previous years of reaping. And so this is how God designed it to be. And he had to explain to the people, because I think much knowledge was lost over a long period of time, even forgetting, the ethics of God, the commandments. He had to reiterate those to Israel when they came out of Egypt. And so God told them that this is how it's to be. This is how the creation was made. This is how he designed it to work. And the land should be able to rest every 7 years, just as people should be able to rest every 7th day. Even ecologists admit that this is a great benefit. And I read an article, and I may have read this to you before. Some farmers practice a similar form of rest for the land through what's called crop rotation. And they'll let an area of land remain untouched for a period of time. In the article I read, it says the core philosophy behind crop rotation is that letting a field lie fallow, it enables it to restore minerals depleted by crops. Crop rotation is all the more important in fields where the soil is prone to depletion or where demanding crops have been grown, because certain crops demand more minerals or nutrition from the soil than others. But because the majority of farmers have long not practiced observing a sabbatical year or crop rotation, we see that companies arose who developed chemical fertilizers and ways to artificially simulate what the soil would otherwise do on its own if it was left alone every 7th year. And so this same author wrote this, saying, in modern practice, fallowing is generally considered a last resort, with fertilizers and intelligent companion planting coming first. When it is used, it's often seasonal, that is fallowing. When it's used, it's often seasonal as opposed to annual. Instead of leaving a field fallow or for an entire year, a farmer might engage in summer fallowing, harvesting one crop late in the spring and planting another early in the fall, giving it half a year rest or a partial year rest. And it's quite at odds with God's command, of course. And when we compare it to the 7th day, God doesn't say half the 7th day you shall rest or a part of the 7th day you shall rest. No, it's the entire day. And so it was that he commanded the entire year of rest for the land. But once again, we see that God's instructions that are for the most benefit, he offers the most benefit to mankind. These are widely ignored by most people. And of course, it's due to perhaps a part of human nature where most people desire to serve mammon rather than God. But it's to our own hurt. It's to the least benefit, actually, to us. Because most farmers don't practice a year of rest for the land, and so they'll use these chemicals, these fertilizers, that they might allow the fruit to continue to grow. They can continue to produce something from the land, but the quality of what is grown suffers greatly. Now, I've seen some fruits and vegetables in the store that look wonderful. I mean, it almost looks like they're on steroids or something. Some sticks of celery are just big and strong, and apples that are like, whoa, I had no idea. Or oranges, some things you're just like, wow, that is so impressive. It looks so good. But most of the fruit or vegetables that look that way is a result of chemical fertilizers, synthetics, something that's not natural. And so because of this, we see for several decades now, after decades, perhaps even a century or more of using these types of chemicals in our food, there are all kinds of different types of illness that have arose, whether it be increases in diabetes or cardiovascular disease, respiratory illness, in particular cancers. We've seen there's just been an explosion of different types of cancer over the last several decades. And so the food that God designed that should be for a great benefit to us and should be even able to heal us at times, to heal us of illness, it's become something that's really not that great for you. Oh, it might be better than just eating junk food all the time, but we don't know how, is it going to cause illness? We don't know. It's kind of a gamble. There was a documentary I did not finish watching, but it was quite interesting, called The Human Experiment. Frankly, we all are a part of this human experiment. All of these things that are going on, the chemicals, the solvents, this modern living, so much of this is just, we don't know exactly what it's going to do to us. Cell phones, we don't know. We're not sure. Probably nothing, we don't know. How long you hold something to your ear that's kind of like a hot spot, or these microwaves or whatever they are, kind of like, we don't know. And some people are more resilient to these than others. So they might have defenses that can fight these things off, and others not so much. So they might get sick earlier on from some of these, the exposure to some of these things. One thing I did notice when I started having our own little garden very early on was something that was different, was taste. So growing our own food, which was primarily organic, the taste was often very different. Better, I would say. And even many of the organic foods we've purchased in the store, you can taste the difference in some of these organic strawberries as opposed to ones that have chemical fertilizers. Broccoli was something. We were getting wild broccoli, and it just had this sweetness to it that like all my life, I never even knew that was there. That doesn't taste like any broccoli I ever had before. So it is very enjoyable. It's something that I'm really, I think, privileged to be a part of. But in any case, let's go over to Deuteronomy 15. Deuteronomy 15. And I want to briefly discuss something else that goes along with the seventh year of rest for the land. At this time, there was also to be a corresponding nationwide release of debt. Now, debt is something that is hard to avoid, especially in our age. There are very few people that have the ability to go out and to pay for a home outright. Here's all the money for the home right now. I personally don't know anybody that's been able to do that. So we have to get a mortgage, and we go into debt for usually decades. People go into debt paying for a home. Most people, in fact, are unable to go out and to purchase a new or even a decent used car without getting some kind of a loan from a bank or perhaps a credit union. We've used that a few times in the past. Millions of people use credit cards to pay for clothing or appliances, things that they just don't have the money for up front, things that they need in the home. And some have even needed to apply for lines of credit to pay for dental work or medical care. I've had to do that a few times. Some people, because of this, will spend years or even the rest of their lives in debt. In our age of suburbs, of apartments, of motor vehicles and modern conveniences, appliances, computers, expensive computers, even these handheld devices that so many of us rely on now to help us to better function or to be more thorough. These things have gotten quite expensive cell phones used to be able to get one for $100 or so. Now it's like $400, I think, is like the cheapest, and they can go up all the way up to $1,000 or more for a handheld device. They're little computers now. It's what they are. In any case, debt seems to be something that's near impossible to avoid for most people. But God did not desire it for it to be this way. He did not desire for people to live a life constantly in debt. God wanted everybody to have those things that they need without having to go in debt for decades trying to pay it off, working to pay off dental implants or student loans. And for this reason, along with the 7th year of rest for the land, at the end of every 7th year, God instituted a release of debt for those people that were in need. Deuteronomy 15 and verse 1 says that at the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release of debts. And this is the form of release. Every creditor who has lent anything to his neighbor shall, and anything is in italics, by the way, every creditor who has lent to his neighbor shall release it. He shall not require it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. Pardon me, knocked my water over. And so, this was considered, as the wording shows us, this was considered to be a blessing from God. It was done for the people and it was done by the people, but it was a way of serving God. And I think some people sometimes forget this, that we are always to be in service to God, but most frequently the way that we best serve God is through good service that we provide to others, to other people. So we've all heard the expression, work like you're working for God, and the reason that so many people use that expression is because you are. Doesn't matter what you're doing. God is paying attention. He knows. And he's thinking, well, if this is how they work for that employer, it shows how they're going to be working for me. We should be doing the best that we can, our best job, be on our best behavior all the time, not just one day a week. Now, interestingly, as we continue to read about this debts that are canceled every 7 years, we see that not all debts had to be forgiven. Look at what it says in verse 3. It says, of a foreigner you may require it, but you shall give up your claim to what is owed by your brother. In other words, of a foreigner, you did not have to cancel the debt. But those people who are considered brethren, family, friends, fellow believers, these people were to give up your claim. So except, again, there's an exception to this though, except when there may be no poor among you, for the Eternal will greatly bless you in the land which the Eternal your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, only if you carefully obey the voice of the Eternal your God to observe with care all these commandments which I command you today. So in other words, God is saying, I'm going to bless people because of their obedience to me. There are going to be people that are going to have more than others. And it can be, not always the case, but it could be related to their obedience to God. And so if people have plenty, if there are people that have plenty because of God's blessing, you don't have to cancel your debt to those people that have plenty, that they could retain the debt. I think this would also be applicable, or perhaps a sign of this could be applied to debt that may be incurred for luxury items, things that were not really needed, not necessary, but we really would like to have them. I really want the 60-inch television instead of the 32-inch television. The 32 works fine, but I'd like the 60. Maybe I'll just go into debt for that, and then at the end of 7 years, I can have that debt canceled. God said, no, not so much. You don't really need that. It's not necessary. So you probably might have to retain the debt for that item. And people should have to retain the debt for some of those things that they acquired that were not needed. If you think about it, you just can't abuse the situation. Can't abuse God's edicts here. It's just logical. It's just the right thing to do. But those people who were in need, who incurred debt, those things would be canceled. But those who were doing well financially, well, have to pay it back. It's just common sense, really. I mean, God is a God of common sense. In verse 6 it says, "For the eternal your God will bless you just as he promised you, and so you shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. You shall reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over you." Which is kind of something maybe America should have paid attention to. We're in debt to so many nations, China in particular. "If there is among you a poor person, man of your brethren," which applies to women too, "within any of the gates in your land which the eternal your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut your hand from your poor brother, but you shall open your hand wide to him, and willingly lend to him the sufficient for his need, whatever he needs." And so basically what God is getting at here is that if there's a need, the person needs something, you should give it to them. You should help them with that and not hold back thinking, oh, wait a minute, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. Wait a minute, the year of release is approaching, and see, if I gave it to them 3 or 4 years before the year of release, I'd get some of my money back. But since the year of release is just around the corner, I'm not going to get much back. I don't want to give it to them. He's saying, don't do that. That's not the right thing to do. The people are in need. Give to those people that are in need when they need it. And in verse 9, "Beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release, is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry out to the eternal against you, and it become a sin among you." Just as I was explaining, as I paraphrase there, "You shall surely give to him or her, and your heart should not be grieved when you give it to them, because for this thing the eternal your God will bless you in all your works and in all to which you put your hand to do, because the poor will never cease from the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall open to your hand wide to your brother, to your poor and your needy in your land." So do not avoid loaning or giving things to people who are in need simply because the year of release is approaching, knowing that you're not going to get much, if anything, back. Do the right thing, help those people in need, and God will bless you for this. It's a promise. You can hold him to it. He will bless us in this. And so those people who accumulated debt while attempting to provide for their own, we see that God did not think they should be punished for decades because of this, in debt for years and years and years. And sometimes we see that debt would even be passed down to children, inherited, if you will. If people want to keep the family farm, if they want to keep the home, or if they want to maintain something that, their parents had purchased, well, they would have to go into debt in order to hang on to it. And so it seems that God says that's unreasonable to do that to people, especially when those people that they might be in debt to have plenty, that they have enough, they're taken care of. People should not be required to remain in debt for decades at a time. Now, an interesting article I had read when studying this subject that I think is related came out of the Associated Press, and it's about a man in Malaysia. And it says this man was named Yahya. Yahya. Sounds right. When Yahya Wahhab's father passed away, Yahya had his father's phone disconnected and paid the final bill of 84 ringgit, which it says is approximately $23. He was then surprised to receive a bill from Telecom Malaysia and shocked after looking inside. It was a bill for 806,400,000,000,000 ringgit, which is approximately, it says, $218 trillion. Now, it was accompanied, actually, with a threatening letter informing Yahya that he must pay the bill within 10 days or face prosecution. Now, it wasn't initially clear, they wrote, whether the outrageous charge was a mistake or if Jehoiah's father's phone line had been illegally used for a period of time after his father's death. But of course, what was immediately clear to Jehoiah was that the bill represented a debt that Jehoiah would never, ever be able to pay in this lifetime. And I think there's a comparison that could be made to this. It's kind of like each of us. You know, we have incurred debt throughout our lives, some financially and some spiritually. We incur debt when we sin. It's a debt, actually, that is held to our charge, but it's something we could never fully pay off on our own, never be able to pay it all off. We have to make an effort to do this. We have to repent. We have to change our behavior, and that's a way of kind of alleviating some of the debt that we might otherwise owe. But a full measure of that debt as a result of sin is beyond our reach to pay on our own. We simply would not be able to do it. And so Christ was kind enough to redeem us from what would otherwise be a debt that would cost us our lives. And God said, I'm not going to let you do that. That's not reasonable. He's a God that's reasonable, and he's merciful, and he cares. And so I think there can be a comparison made to this year of release of debt where people would not be able to pay it off. They're just going to live miserably in debt the rest of their lives. And it's something that people were to practice, understanding what God would do for them and what he has done now for each of us. That we should not be bound to a miserable life because of debt. People should not be bound to debt because if they want to have a little piece of property or a home. They shouldn't be bound to paying for this for the rest of their lives just so they can survive. And even more than that, to thrive. It's not God's way. Similar to this year of release of debts is a release of those people who were indentured servants. And I'm going to just speak briefly about this. In verses 12 through 18 in the same chapter, it says that if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and serves you 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free. And when you send him away from you, him or her, you shall not let them go away empty-handed. You shall supply him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, and from your winepress, from what the Eternal has blessed you with. You shall give to him. In other words, a decent wage. They should go out being able to get a good start on a life independently. That's just fair. It's just the right thing to do. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Eternal your God redeemed you. And therefore I command you this thing today. If it happens that he says to you, I will not go away from you because he loves you and your house, since he prospers with you, then you shall take an awl and thrust it through his ear to the door. It's talking about piercing their ear. And he shall be your servant forever. Also to your female servant you shall do likewise. It shall not seem hard to you when you send him away free from you, for he has been worth a double hired servant in serving you 6 years. Then the Eternal your God will bless you in all that you do. And so we see that there's this pattern here of after 6 years, the 7th year they should go free. But it seems here that the pattern did not have to align itself with the year of rest of the land or a release of debts every 7 years. And there are more details about this in Exodus 21 that indicates that if the servant were to be married, became married while they were your servant, and if they had children, that they would go out with them. They're family to them now. It's just the right thing to do. Send them away with their wife or husband and their children. And of course, as it just said, if they want to remain a servant, they say, hey, I like this. This is a good life. I enjoy this. That they could stay a servant forever if they wanted to. And there's a procedure for that. But again, we see it's simply just the right thing to do. Slavery was not something that God intended to be this abusive, one-way relationship where one person got everything they wanted, the other person got little to nothing and was abused. Those people who found it necessary to become a servant to someone else, they were not destined to remain a servant for the rest of their lives. They could if they wanted to, but it wasn't something that they had to commit to forever. Now, interestingly, like I said, though it's associated with the year of release, it's stated right here after debt's canceled every 7 years. It doesn't have to occur on the year of rest of the land. It was done after those servants had served for 6 years. And of course, if they didn't, it doesn't mean everybody had to commit for 6 years. It was usually the period of service was determinant on what was owed. You know, what was owed the person, then that would determine how many years they would be a servant to the family or to the individual. But 6 years was the maximum. And of course, this could change depending on the Jubilee. And that's something I'm going to talk more about tomorrow. But Deuteronomy 31, and we're going to end over there. Something else that was to occur during the 7th year rest of the land was an event that would take place during the Feast of Tabernacles. And in the Eternal Church of God, we're aware of this event. In Deuteronomy 31, verse 9, so Moses wrote this law and delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who bore the ark of the covenant of the Eternal, and to all of the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time in the year of release, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Eternal your God in the place which he chooses, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Gather the people together, men and women and little ones, and the stranger who is within your gates, that they may hear and that they may learn to fear the Eternal your God, and carefully observe all the words of this law, and that their children, who have not known it, may hear and learn to fear the Eternal your God, as long as you live in the land which you cross the Jordan to possess. So this was an important aspect of maintaining a nation under God, a moral nation under God. Everyone needed to be on the same page ethically in this nation, and copies of biblical text, which may have consisted only of the Torah at that time, these were not widely available to everyone. It actually was very expensive for many years, for centuries, very expensive to make copies of the Bible for people. Now, there were Levites that were to be stationed in each city, and these Levites would be there to serve the people, to give instruction and counsel and what have you. And the law, of course, the law of God was to always be a focal point of everybody's lives. And so this is something that would need to be talked about, discussed, rehearsed, and read to the people at different times of the year and throughout the year. But in many cases, particularly in situations, and some of us in Montana are more familiar with the rural areas on the outskirts of cities, that these people didn't have motor vehicles. It wasn't easy to get to an area where there might be a Levite or a synagogue or a copy of biblical text. And so many of these people would not be able to hear it verbatim very often. Perhaps just get some paraphrasing occasionally and get the idea, but not hearing every word. And there's a lot that can be learned when we hear every single word of God, when we put all this sentence together properly. Paraphrasing can be helpful, and it can suffice at times and for a time, but God desired that people hear all of it, verbatim, every word of the law. And so as a reminder of this, of God's covenant with Israel and what he expected of them, during the Feast of Tabernacles, when all heads of household would travel to Jerusalem to keep the feast, the law would be openly declared to the people at that time. Now, reading of the law does not mean reading Genesis all the way through the end of Deuteronomy. And I won't go into that, but there's a reason for that. In any case, reading of the law is something that the Eternal Church of God chose to do beginning back in 2001. Now, we are unsure of when the count to the year of release, which would, of course, tell us when the count to the Jubilee begins. Nobody knows exactly when that count began. So because of that, we chose, well, we're going to begin reading the law in 2001. And that is when we started, and we've read the law every 7 years since that time. In fact, just a note, we're actually due to read the law in the year 2022. So the law includes declaring the holy days, and we know tomorrow is the Feast of Weeks. It's also called the Feast of Harvests, or Harvest, first fruits of your labors which have been sown in the field. It's called a day of first fruits, and it has much to do with this year of release, with the year of land rest, the forgiveness of debts, and also the year of Jubilee. And we're going to talk more about that tomorrow when we discuss Pentecost and its relationship to the Jubilee.